So we've been talking for a few weeks about starting up our Nintendo Watcher Plays, and we were getting kicked off with that series with Final Fantasy,
Yes.
the
Yep.
original.
Yeah. Yeah, we're in it now. I mean, today's episode is us chatting about the very first Final Fantasy game, right? Final Fantasy 1 for the Famicom or Nintendo Entertainment System here in the US. Do a quick little just refresher, right, on what this whole deal is. Essentially, again, this is going to be a series where we do a deep dive into the games of the Final Fantasy series. When I say deep dive, I just mean a little bit of background history, some discussion of where they came from, what they brought to the genre, and then primarily reviews. Right? We're playing through them, and then we're going to talk about our experiences. How do
Yeah,
they hold up?
and for some of these games, it's the first time either one of us has played through them. So
Yeah,
I've been really looking forward to it. I didn't play through this first Final Fantasy game until late last year. I
yeah.
just missed it completely. So I'm looking forward to this entire series.
Yeah, so just so we're, clear and transparent on it, we are playing the Pixel remasters for these, right? They are coming out on the Switch later this year, and so we decided we're going to dive in and do the Pixel remasters for this. So obviously, take that into account when you listen to what we, are saying, and when you think about how we're addressing gameplay mechanics and story elements and things like that. Not much is changed in the Pixel remasters, but they do have a fresh coat of paint and some quality of life updates. So we'll be, engaging with that as well. But
Yeah, and just a note on that before we go any further, the original Final Fantasy, has been remade so many times. There
mhm,
was a version of it on the PlayStation 1. There was a version of it, I think, on the Game Boy Advance. There's a lot of different versions, an iOS and Android version. I think that the Pixel Remaster is the closest to the original NES
mhm,
version that there is. The magic
yeah.
system's the same. They've obviously squashed the bugs that were in the original, but just for the sake of the version that we're playing, the kind of things we're going to be talking about, it is the Pixel Remaster. But I think if we're just comparing things, it's probably the closest to the original you can get.
Yeah, one thing about the Pixel remasters that's notable is they ripped out most of the extra content that was added into remasters and remakes of these games. So they are an attempt to get as close to the original as they can while adding some quality of life, like some speed up in combat, some better
Auto
save
targeting.
functionality, yeah, auto battle, that kind of stuff. Though it's kind of a rudimentary auto battle system and speed up system in this first one at least. But so that's what we're talking about, right? And Final Fantasy One is the first game in the series from 1987. In fact, it released exactly 4 days after I was born in Japan. Um,
Wow.
yeah, 4 days after I was born in the Final Fantasy. So, obviously there's something there. But it didn't come out in the US until 1990, I believe. Check my notes.
Did you
Yes,
play
July
it?
of 1990. When I was
Did you
four
play
years
it?
old,
Yeah.
yes, I did.
No, no,
Yeah,
no. 4 days.
4 days old. Yes, yeah. It was the first game I ever played. I remember it on my Japanese Famicom system. I didn't speak a lick of Japanese, still don't, but no. I actually played it for the first time for this episode. I've never played the first Final Fantasy. In fact, I've never played the first five Final Fantasies.
Wow,
Um,
really?
no, I've now completed one and two. I'm part of the way through three for this, series that we're doing. But I had never played the original NES or the other SNES games, 4 and 5. My first experience with the series was actually Final Fantasy 3 America 6 Japan, right? So that was where I was introduced to the series and continued and played pretty much every mainline since then. But these early games are sort of a blind spot, or were a blind spot for me. So it's been kind of cool to check it out.
Sorry,
But
didn't mean to derail you.
no, that's
Originally
fine.
came out in the US in 1990, so there were
Yes.
several years between.
And I don't know if this is apocryphal. I couldn't get any super clear clarification on it. I know the game I think was originally supposed to be called Fighting Fantasy, but because of copyright or something like that, they named it Final Fantasy. Some people have apocryphally said that it was because it was, Square was in such dire straits at the time that this game they thought might be one of their last games they were produced, and that's the name. I don't know how much credibility there is to it, but it is true, right, that this game sort of really blew up when it came out. It was huge for Square at the time. Enix was doing some really, really impressive stuff with the Dragon Quest series already. In fact, the first Dragon Quest was a major influence on the original creator of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi. In creating this game. So when it came out, it was sort of like a phenomena in Japan, blew up pretty big there. A more tempered response in the West for the first handful of entries, but an immediate success and a big, pretty much the flagstone of Square from that point forward. Still to this day, perhaps their most important franchise. Right, with
Yeah.
16
We
right
should
around the corner.
we should take a quick beat here to just talk about the differences between Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. So Dragon Quest was single protagonist. You didn't have a party in that
Mm-hmm.
first game. Um, it was a first person battle system.
Yeah.
So you weren't actually seeing, your character's attack. You couldn't see the battlefield. So when you're playing these games today, like it's pretty easy to see, okay, these are really similar, but I mean, Final Fantasy was doing some really incredible things to up what we expect from turn-based
Mm-hmm.
RPGs. And really what they did in Final Fantasy 1 is pretty much what we have today for turn-based
Yeah.
RPGs.
I mean, it's absolutely the blueprint. This game being the blueprint for a lot of systems that would get fleshed out and elevated in later entries, but also the genre in general. The JRPG genre really took two paths, and I think Dragon Quest became a little closer to Final Fantasy in some ways as it went along, though there was various points in which the two series diverged. Dragon Quest definitely has done its own thing and is an amazing and super impactful series in its own right. But I think that the DNA of Final Fantasy maybe had a broader, at least in the West, a broader
Yeah.
appeal, right? A broader mainstream appeal. It had more influence for Western players like ourselves than Dragon Quest did. Though that has shifted in recent years. I think there's a more level playing field. There's a lot of respect for Dragon Quest that maybe wasn't as well received in the West nowadays. But to get back to kind of the background here, one thing that's worth noting is just the creative team that was behind this original Final Fantasy, because it's easy to forget nowadays with the role that people like Tetsuya Nomura play at the company at Square Enix nowadays, that this was through and through the brainchild and darling of Hironobu Sakaguchi, right? The original creator of the first game, the director of the first, I believe, 5 Final Fantasies, and a pretty much mainstay executive producer, director, etc. at Square Enix all the way through 2006 when he left to start Mistwalker, where he still resides, right? Who recently released the phenomenal iOS JRPG Fantasian. If you've never played that, I would recommend checking it out. But
I hadn't played that one. Is
it's
it is
really
it
good.
good?
Yeah, it's really good. And it's a cool thing about it is all the backgrounds are actual real life dioramas. Like all the settings are real life dioramas that they mapped the characters onto and stuff, and it looks really impressive. Plus, it just plays really well and it feels like an old school Final Fantasy in a lot of ways, but does some really cool, unique things. But in addition to Sakaguchi, who was sort of in charge of this team, who was put on as lead of this project and director of it, he brought in a lot of people that would go on to be very influential at Square, right? Including my favorite, Akitoshi Kawazu of the Saga series, who served as sort of the battle designer, battle planner for this first Final Fantasy. You can see a lot of that in the magic system and class system and things like that. The addition of um, like elemental affinities, right? Weaknesses and strengths versus certain elements stuff came from him, along with a lot of other, mainstays of combat that would then branch off into the Saga series. And you also had Koichi Ishii, who later would go on to be a very influential figure in the Mana series, right? Who is part of this original team. And so, really, future powerhouses at Square got their start, not necessarily their start, but were really coming into their own in the company with this first game. And in the first couple of Final Fantasies, Kawazu stuck around for, I believe, the second Final Fantasy. You see him very heavily when we get to that episode. We'll talk a lot about his influence, which is probably the closest to a Saga game that Final Fantasy ever got. Before a lot of these would then branch off and go do their own things, with Mana, Saga, and down the road even Matsuno of Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story fame was a Sakaguchi sort of protege. In addition to that, there's two icons of JRPGs and Final Fantasy in particular that got their start in this game, and those are the character designer and lead artist Yoshitaku Amano, who is pretty much synonymous with Final Fantasy character design and monster design and all of that. I mean, his artwork for the original games and even current games is just iconic. If you've never seen any of his work, just look at any of the title screens in those old Final Fantasy games. I mean, he has a very distinct art style, and was around since the beginning.
Yeah, and this particular version of Final Fantasy One, if you go into the menu system, it has that collection of artwork, and a lot of it
Mhm.
is concept art. So we'll
Yeah,
we'll scroll through some of it now. If you're watching the video, you can see some of that. But
yeah.
this is the artwork is what drew me to the Final Fantasy series in the first place.
Yeah.
And like you said, like it's still in the DNA of the series now, even coming up to Final Fantasy 16, right? The summer.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, the at least the cover art is paying homage to the stuff that was happening back in '87.
Yeah, and it's really cool to see, as this, this will probably be a recurring thing about what when we talk about these, because I'm really invested in his art as well as the music of Nobuo Uematsu, who went on to be, probably the most famous, iconic video game composer of all time, in a lot of people's minds, especially if you're a fan of JRPGs. He's kind of the top of the pile there. He did the soundtrack for this game and pretty much every other Final Fantasy, with a handful of exceptions. Up until very recently, I think he's semi-retired at this point, maybe fully retired by now, but he is sort of a staple of especially these first 20, probably 15 or so mainline games he's involved in, not counting spin-offs and things like that. And so, this team was, originally, kind of patchworked together in an attempt to put together a game to build off of the fame of Dragon Quest, the kind of spark that it ignited when it released, and was not viewed as like a focus for Square, right? Until midway or so through development, when all of a sudden people started to see that, oh, there was something special here. And more people were brought on, and it eventually released to, like I said, pretty good critical and fan acclaim in Japan. Would be relatively obscure, though still well known in the West, until a few entries later, at which point it really blew up. I mean, you could make the argument that 7 is when it really took off in the West, which I think is a fair argument, though I think 6 or 3, as it was released in the West, did phenomenally well as, in addition. So we'll get to that as we get further on. But regardless, this game originally sort of came from the roots of tabletop RPGs, with the Wizardry and Ultima series being the more video gamey connections that we can think of. Richard Garriott's Ultima series and Wizardry, which is still pretty big in Japan, if I recall correctly, are two series that really had their hooks in Sakaguchi and the team. And things like the crystal motif that we've come to associate with Final Fantasy, the four elemental crystals that get brought together in order to stop some earth-ending
Yeah, the crystals that are in
monstrosity.
every RPG, right?
Yeah, yeah, they got their start here in the first game. I mean, the story will, and we get to it, pretty bare bones, but the crystal motif is there, and the job system, right, which would become sort of a focus of later entries, get greatly expanded on in 3, and then later in, I believe, 5 has a really extensive job system, all the way up to the tactics games and others, with the MMOs that came out in the late 90s, 2000s, and such. So this game is kind of, like I said, the blueprint for everything that came after it. And playing it today, right, feels very different, I'm sure, than playing it back in 87 or 90. But regardless, I kind of want to start there, right, with just our personal background. So we've already touched on it a little bit, but not just this game, but this series. When did you first become aware of Final Fantasy as a series, and then this game in particular? And is this your first time playing it? If not, when was the first time that you played it? And was it the Pixel remaster, or was it a different version of it?
Yeah, the Pixel Remaster was the first time through it for me. My first experience with Final Fantasy, though, I think, if I remember correctly, it was Final Fantasy 3 or 6
Mm-hmm.
for the Super Nintendo, but I didn't finish it. Like, I didn't really get it at the time. And it wasn't until Final Fantasy 7 that it started to click with me, and I really loved that game a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, what sold me on the entire franchise was 10.
Yeah.
Just the jump to 3D and the power of the PlayStation 2, like all of that, I got really caught up in it. And
Yeah.
also, that was the last game that had the turn-based combat that you associate with the first 10 games, um, roughly 10 games. So that was my first experience with it. Final Fantasy 1, though, this is the first time I played through it, the Pixel Remaster.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad, man. Like, with knowing what I know now about the original, um, the Pixel Remaster is the way to go. Like, in the first game, people don't remember this, but I think this was even true in the early Dragon Quest games. There wasn't an auto targeting system in battle.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
if you tried to attack an enemy, but somebody else in your party had killed the enemy already, you just wasted a turn. So it's just like small things like that
Mm-hmm.
we don't have to worry about now, because we have a modernized version of it that really keeps the spirit of it, I think,
Yeah.
but gets rid of a lot of um the ancient ways that the
Yeah. And
original version had.
we'll get into more of that when we get into sort of the gameplay and the mechanics of this game, from our experience. Again, we're reviewing the Pixel remaster version, so take all of that into account. But before we do that, just background from my side of things as well. Like I said, this is my first time playing any of the original 5, right, Final Fantasy games. So Pixel remasters will be my first experience with all of them, which I know for some people that's blasphemous for a few of these entries, but at the same time, it's what's most available, and it's what's going to be easiest for the majority of consumers when it releases later this year on consoles. So that seems the most appropriate, right, at this point in time. But as for the series, I've already mentioned this. My first game in the series was Final Fantasy 3 or 6 in the actual chronology of the series. But I actually came to Final Fantasy through Chrono Trigger and Legend of Mana. So I played those two games on the Super Nintendo before I played Final Fantasy 3. I remember that growing up, I was we had a Nintendo. We had an NES, but we only had a couple of games there. We had the old Gold Cart, Zelda, we had Duck Hunt, and I think Super Mario. Like that was it. That was what we owned. We weren't really a big gaming household when I was little. My dad had one, and we had a couple games. That was it. And then when I was in elementary school, I think like sixth grade or something, fifth or sixth grade or whatever it was. My parents remarried, and my stepbrothers had a Super Nintendo, and on that Super Nintendo they had a handful of games. Three that I most iconically remember were Chrono Trigger, Legend of Mana, and Final Fantasy III. And the very first game of those that I ever played was, or Secret of Mana, sorry, was Secret of Mana, right? Because you could play that multiplayer. So if you had, you could play up to 3 players if you had the multi-tap. And my brothers let me, they didn't really let me use their systems growing up, but because that was multiplayer, I was able to get in and play with them, right? And so I played through Legend of Mana, really loved it, and then eventually they kind of moved on to the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64, and so I picked up all the games on the Super Nintendo, right? I was
Wait a second. You went from Secret of Mana with like a real time
yeah,
battle system to Chrono Trigger,
yep,
which has this active battle system, so getting closer to turn based, then going all the way back to a turn based
yeah.
Final Fantasy VI.
Yeah, I went back to Final Fantasy 6. Final Fantasy 6 was my favorite of the three. Absolutely fell in love with it. Played the heck out of it, and then pretty much devoured everything that Square Enix released in the genre from that point up to present day. Right?
Do you remember thinking much about the battle system then? Because I think
No, I
when I
remember
was
being very confused by it. I remember
yeah,
that because I was young, I was little, and I didn't understand how skilling worked in Final, like how building characters worked in Final Fantasy VI. I never really got much of a hang of like espers and building magic characters and giving them stat boosts through equipping espers on them for a given time, but like all of that. I could barely pull off half of Sabin's moves, which were like fighting
I still
game
can't.
style. Yeah.
I
So
still
like
can't.
I was worthless, right? At that game. Later I came back, played it many times since, but my first playthrough was just, it was a comedy of errors as I stumbled my way through to that final set piece. But it definitely stuck with me, right? The genre stuck with me, and I played pretty much all of the PS1 through now from that point forward, right? Though we'll talk more about my kind of spotty history with that when we get to Final Fantasy 7 and 8, which are interesting blind spots for me. And I think part of that has to do with, like I said, with my stepbrothers got the PlayStation 1, I was back playing the Super Nintendo. So I played the Super Nintendo for many years after the PlayStation came out. And I actually missed 7 and 8 when they first came out. 9 was my first PlayStation 1. And then
At the
I played
tail
through.
end.
Yeah, right. And then I played a lot of other Square Enix games on the PlayStation, which we'll talk about. But for some reason, 7 and 8 passed me by. So talk about it later. But anyways, so for me, this is again my first time playing this particular game, and honestly, I think just general first impression, glad I did. Right, I think it holds up in some very interesting ways and feels incredibly dated in a lot of others. So I kind of want to make this manageable and to give some sort of structure to later episodes in this series. We're going to tackle the games, and we got to hold ourselves to this, right? We can't jump ahead, right? To categories, right? We're going to start with story. We're going to talk about the story, generally speaking, what we thought about it, how it played out, all of that. Then we're going to move into music, and then we're going to talk gameplay. But we're going to talk gameplay through exploration, in the form of the overworld, cities, and dungeons. And then we're going to talk about combat. We're going to talk about job systems, combat systems, spells, parties, bosses, like that kind of stuff. So, in order to give it some structure, we're going to go through each of these categories in sequence to kind of build out our thoughts on the various Final Fantasy games. Do a little bit of a deeper, more focused review than we've maybe done in the past. So we're going to start with story. We've already talked a little bit about this when we talked about the inception of the game, right? But thoughts? Let's try this. Can you summarize the story of Final Fantasy 1 for me, Justin? Do you recall enough about it to summarize?
It's a good question. So you are the 4 heroes of light, the light heroes, 4 of them in total. Um, there's a fake out at the beginning of the game where it seems like it's, you go save the princess game, and then that gets turned on its head, which I really love. But what you're trying to do is find the 4 elemental crystals hidden around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, you take on the final boss, who is a character you might remember from the beginning of the game, but he's unleashed a demon called Chaos, and you take on Chaos, but you're thrown back in time when you take him on. And then it turns out that the heroes of light that you'd heard about the entire game was actually you in the past, and you were always meant to save the world because it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. And did I get all of
Yep.
it? That's like the
I
main
mean,
points, right?
generally, yeah. Well, what has not been noted is that 90% of what you just said is delivered in a crawl at the end of the game.
Yes. So
90% of the story, I would say, is delivered
it's
through a literary, like a Star Wars esque crawl at the end after you defeat the final boss. Um,
yeah.
this
This
game
is
is light on
it.
story, is
It
putting it
really
kindly.
is. It really is. I remember thinking, when I was reading the crawl, and when I was playing before, I was like, man, I can just like turn my brain off and play this game. Like I'm just going and finding these new things. I don't know if there's a story here at all. And then you get to the crawl at the end that explains everything. But the thing that I remember most about playing through it is, um, wow, Final Fantasy One really set the stage for all of these crazy time traveling,
Mm-hmm.
super complicated stories that we got later. The execution here was just awful.
Not great. But what I thought was really cool about it is it does, like we said, um, with Final Fantasy 16, there was some weird discourse going on about like, oh, hey, back to the roots of Final Fantasy with a medieval high fantasy story, and then people forget that in the first game, like there's war mechs, there's robot, entirely futuristic civilizations that you travel to up in the sky. There is time traveling, right, where you go 2,000 years, like you said, back into the past to defeat the big bad before his events of the future happen, right? And it's like this game was doing everything that Final Fantasy did, and all of it is contextual for the most part, right? All of this is just contextual storytelling in the original game. I mean, you see creatures changing, right? And you learn, oh, I'm going after the fiend of air because I'm in a zone full of air elementals, and there's wind related monsters and things like that. Or I'm in a fiery volcano, a staple of pretty much every video game that's ever come since. So I must be in the realm of the fire crystal and things like that, right? And you only learn about these things by talking to NPCs repeatedly, sometimes by traveling to places, doing something, and then going back to previous locations and hoping something has changed because of the events that you have done. You will sometimes go through an entire dungeon, realize, oh, I was supposed to do something else first before I did this, have to go back, talk to that person, then go back to the dungeon because you missed a trigger that you needed to go into a particular place, or you are just required by the story to go through it, hit a point of no return, go back to another location, talk to someone, get an item, return, and progress forward, right? And so the game only has pretty much NPC dialogue. There's very few like talk to the king and he'll give you the next narrative breadcrumbs. Like he'll tell you like maybe a city that's in a particular direction. You head to that city, and then some random NPC in there, someone who you would not expect to be the person bearing the news you need, will tell you just a tidbit of something going on in the world. And so you say, "Oh, that sounds interesting." You head there, and if you're lucky, that's the next trigger. But
Yeah, you have to seek out those NPCs though. Like you
yeah,
said, like it's not somebody that you think, "Oh yeah, I've got to go talk to this person." Usually it's somebody who's like way out of the way, and they say something that doesn't register with you at all, and you just have to catalog it. When
yeah,
I was going back through it before we had our our recording tonight, I was noticing that some of the NPCs that you meet talk about things that are going to happen in like the next act.
yeah.
It's just stuff that you have to catalog away and then remember,
Mhm.
"Oh, yeah, somebody did say something about that when I was in this, town 3 towns ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And
It's not intuitive.
no, it's, but what's nice about it, right? Like I said, is it makes the game feel more natural. Like it feels natural to me.
It's a great
More.
world building
Yes,
tool.
because I think about all the games we played today, and we're kind of stepping on some exploration and gameplay stuff here, but I'm not going to get. We'll get into more in a minute. But in a lot of games now, you open up a quest log. It tells you exactly where to go, who to talk to. There's a marker on the map showing the pertinent person to discuss something with, and I find that a lot of games I play these days, I spend no time talking to random NPCs. I miss out on a lot of like contextual world building because all I'm doing is going from, map marker to map marker, from quest checkbox to quest checkbox, and I'm doing very little exploration. And so this game really encourages you to kind of get out there and just immerse yourself in the game a little bit, right? To think about, what would be the next logical move for my characters, right? I mean, I've come to this city. I can see that the continent that I'm on, based off of the map, sprawls a little to the north, but mostly to the south. Where should I travel next? Well, let's talk to a couple people, see if someone mentions something that might send me in the right direction. And it does feel really rewarding when you hit those moments, right? When you puzzle something together, like you said, that an NPC 3 towns back told you, right? That suddenly has relevance to a moment that you're experiencing now in the
Yeah.
gameplay.
But comparing it really quick, I just want to go back for a second to what you mentioned about playing, like comparing it to a modern game, playing a
Mhm.
modern game that tells you exactly where to go. Modern games, modern RPGs might span 30, 40, 50 hours, maybe more. And that's when you're doing, A to B gameplay.
Mhm.
You're doing just the bare minimum to try to get through the game in a, you know, normal amount of time, right? I think we're losing something in that, the bloat that we get with modern games that
Mhm.
Final Fantasy One doesn't have.
Yeah.
You know, every NPC's dialogue contributes to the story, and it's on you to go around and talk to everybody. But it's not like a modern game where you have NPCs who are just saying things that have no impact on what you're doing. They're just there to fill the world. And it seems like a small thing, but if you think about the team at Square that was building this and writing the dialogue, it was all like a really intricate spider web that they were building, from city to
Yeah.
city all through this game. It's really impressive.
Yeah. I mean, again, as a narrative, it's thin. It doesn't have a lot going for it. It's got some really cool, tropes that at the time were, somewhat unique, especially to this genre, to video games, not to, fiction, but to video
Especially on
games.
consoles.
Yeah. And so, it was doing stuff that a lot of console gamers had never seen. PC gamers had experienced a lot of this stuff, and the RPGs were a well-trodden genre by this point, but console games were not as deep with this kind of stuff. And so it was really cool to see a game like this at the time, I'm sure. And it feels good to have a game that encourages the player to explore, right? I still find games like that today to be the most. That's why I gravitate to the Saga series, and I've talked about that at length, right? Is they don't hold your hand, they don't tell you where to go, they give you breadcrumbs and you have to figure them out. I think of Elden Ring from last year as a game, right? Or Breath of the Wild, even, which has a little bit more of that, you know, navigation, help, but still feels like a game that you're encouraged to seek out, right? The narrative, which I think is really cool. But we'll get into more of this as we talk about exploration and gameplay later. So I want to take just a quick segue to music, because you know again, we've talked about him already. Nobuo Uematsu is the king of JRPG soundtracks. Most every game in the series has just absolutely fantastic music, and there's at least one or two tracks that just stand out, I think, from every game. You ask most gamers, some of their favorite songs, chances are a Final Fantasy track sneaks its way in there at some point. But we're working with 8-bit audio in this era. Beeps and boops, MIDI soundtracks, that kind of stuff. Though I will say the Pixel remasters have been updated, expanded, and very fantastic. I
Very
think,
good.
um,
Very good.
you know, remastered OST, but you can also navigate to the original OST should you want to listen to some of those original beeps and boops. So thoughts on the music for this game, just generally speaking, did you enjoy it? Did some of it, anything particular stand out to you? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, nothing. I didn't have a particular song that stood out like, oh
Hmm.
man, like that is super powerful. But what stood out to me again with the Pixel remaster, so it's all remastered stuff, and like you said, it sounds great. The intro prelude that you get in virtually every other Final Fantasy game. Um, so you've got that, you've got the battle music, and you've got the celebration music
Hmm.
at the end of the battle. And I don't know if those were in the original. I think they were,
Hmm.
but okay, so they were. Um, just hearing those in a like their original context was
Yeah.
really powerful to me. And then thinking about where they went after that, how those tunes changed just a bit generation after generation. And I mean, up until Final Fantasy VII, the remake, we're still hearing those same tunes. They still sound as fresh as they did back then. That was the thing that stood out to me about the music. It was just as powerful now as I expect it was back then. Maybe even more so now that we have this lineage of Final Fantasy that has relied on these melodies to take them
Hmm.
through.
Yeah, yeah. For me, what's just fascinating about this early soundtrack is that so many of the motifs, right, that would carry on into future games, got their start here, and you can really hear the sound. Even in the original soundtrack, the old 8-bit soundtrack, you can still hear the the iconic uh, you know leitmotifs and stuff that recur throughout the series. Even these early battle themes, right? Standard battle themes and boss themes. Iconic stuff in most games, and I think the ones in Final Fantasy One are a lot of fun. I was actually thinking about playing through this game. I remember playing through the re-release that they did recently, the collection of mana, right? And there's a the original Secret of Mana soundtrack is included in that, right? In the Secret of Mana that they have there. I was replaying that game when the collection came out, and I remember very quickly noticing how short those loops were, right? The music loops, and remembering like, yeah, 16-bit, 8-bit era JRPGs had very short loops for their songs, right? Because there was just not enough room on the cartridges for these games to have that much. So, it was very rudimentary back then, right? And yet, listening to like some of the original Final Fantasy One soundtracks, those loops, for some reason, there's something about Uematsu's compositions that they don't tire or grate on me the way that like I had to mute Secret of Mana for large stretches because it became very apparent to me how frequently these loops were repeating and how repetitive the music was, and it just wasn't something that grabbed me in the way that playing through the pixel remaster of Final Fantasy One, and obviously with both the soundtracks in my mind, I think even the 8-bit sort of short versions of them still hold up. Right, there's some really good music.
Yeah, there's some depth there
Yeah.
with those chip tunes. Some depth that you don't get elsewhere necessarily. Like I remember now that you mentioned it, those Secret of Mana tunes, I like them a lot,
Hmm.
but they do get old. They get really old really fast.
Yeah, and a lot of these old games do, but there's something about the Final Fantasy series that even in those early games, man, I dig them. Like, it's some of the best 8-bit music out there. So again, I think that the Pixel remaster soundtrack remasters are very, very good. So obviously, I played with those, and just dove into some of the old tracks just to kind of hear them and see what the compare some differences. But even that old stuff holds up, I think. Right, but
Yeah.
let's get to the most important thing, what we actually want to talk about, and that's gameplay. right? This is what we want to talk about. This is what's really interesting about these games because, again, we've already started to talk a little bit about the exploration of this game, right? This game is not one that holds your hand. It very rarely tells you deliberately where to go unless you seek out those answers. Um, and it's broken up into three categories, as I would say. There's overworld exploration, which takes three different forms on its own. You get foot travel, you get boat travel later on, and eventually you get airship travel, right? All iconic modes of movement in the series. Then you have cities, right? Various cities spread throughout the world. These are little like hubs. You'll see a little hub of a city on the map, and you enter it, and then all of a sudden you're in a new map, right? Which is shops and inns and things like that. A cathedral to resurrect your characters should they die, because you couldn't really do that in the first game otherwise. And then dungeons, which is where you spend the bulk of your time in this game. Some very twisty, windy, large dungeons, in
Oh
fact, in
man.
this game. Some may be a little too long in the tooth, but we'll get to all that. And then you've got combat, right? We've got things like the job system. We've got the party combat, right? Turn-based combat, spell system, which I want to talk a little bit about, and then some bosses, which we'll get into. So let's start with exploration. We can tackle this in any order. We don't need to go down the list any specific way, but generally speaking, thoughts on the exploration. What did you like about it? What stressed you out about it? What was what holds up and what doesn't?
Yeah, the thing that strikes me probably the most profoundly about this is how big the map is.
Yeah.
This is a sprawling map for a
Hmm.
game that was made in 1987,
Yeah.
and it takes time to get around. If you're doing it on foot, it takes a long time to get around. I think they did a great job with the um, just like the pacing of when you get the canoe, when you
Hmm.
get the ship, when you get the airship, so that it makes exploration a lot easier.
Yeah.
But it does it so gradually that you really appreciate by the time you get the airship and you're able to zoom around the map as much as you want, you truly appreciate that you can cover vast distances
Yeah.
in a couple of seconds.
Yeah, it's really cool because, like you said, the world feels really big. But what I found was, fascinating because I expected there to be very large stretches of just tedium, right? With the movement speed is not super great over land. The map is very large, especially early on. Foot travel takes a bit of time, and yet they do a really good job of placing um the critical path, like the towns and dungeons and caves and things that you're meant to visit. They space them out well so that you don't feel like you're spending too much time traveling overland before you arrive at the next destination. I didn't find that to be the case. There's maybe one or two egregious. I think the marsh cave, which is a
Oh,
rather infamous
Marsh Cave.
dungeon in Final Fantasy One, is perhaps like the most egregious segment of the game, where you're pretty far from the closest town. You got to travel quite a bit overland. Then you go through one of the biggest and most obnoxious, especially because of when it happens. And the use of status effects early on in the game can be pretty brutal with the spell system. So like you end up in a situation where other than a few kind of very notable moments, you're never traveling for too long anywhere. You're hitting landmarks at a pretty regular clip. And like you said, once you get the airship, I mean, it's game over, right? Like it's so much fun to zoom around the map, especially to like see the progression. Um, am I mixing up Final Fantasy 1 and 2? But in Final Fantasy 1, don't you get the ship first and the
Yeah.
canoe second, right?
No, no, no. You get the
Or
canoe
is it
first.
you get the canoe?
Or
Okay.
wait, maybe I'm mixing up Final Fantasy 2
I
and
think
1
Final
too.
Fantasy 2 you get the canoe first and then the ship. I'm not sure what it is, but
No, I think you're right. I'm getting mixed up. I think you get the ship first.
yeah, because you take the canoe to go to the Mount Golg, right, with the fire fiend, right, the fiend of
Yeah,
fire,
yeah,
and
because
that's
you have
after you've sailed down to another pocket.
yeah, because you have these huge bodies of water, but you can't get into like little rivers and streams.
Until
Yep.
late, yeah,
Yep.
which is
Yep.
weird.
Which
It's funny, but
so weird.
yeah,
But the other thing
uh,
about the airship though is like I really like that you can't just land it anywhere.
yes,
So you've got this airship, you can go anywhere, but it doesn't mean you can explore the map, entirely with it. you can only land in these huge open areas, and lots of RPGs have done this since then. But it's just a good way to make sure that the airship doesn't break the game.
Yeah, and it's cool too because like all of these are tied to different moments of very impactful moments of the narrative and stuff like that. They each help you achieve a different crystal, like access a new area of land, meet new people. There's some really fun exploration moments where you get your canoe, you go to the volcano, you get the fire crystal, then you all of a sudden you've got access to the airship. Shortly after that, you take the airship up to the northern part of the continents, and you start to find communities of people and new cultures and religions and different groups and factions and stuff that you didn't know existed before. It expands some of the world and the narrative, and it all unravels at a very steady clip, because this game's only about 15 to 20 hours if you're playing through it pretty quickly. It's not a long experience,
Yeah.
but it
Do you remember how long your
unfolds.
playthrough was?
I think I came in at just about 16 hours to credits, if I recall
I
correctly.
think mine was like 18. So
Yeah,
yeah,
but it felt good. It felt really breezy, which I didn't expect from a game of this era. I
were you
especially
expecting it to be
because
grindy?
I
And
did. I
it is
expected it to be.
grindy.
It's a little bit, but I found that this is where the modern features come in, right? Like the encounter rate is too high in all of these old games. The encounter rate's always too high. But that is mitigated by the fact that for much of the game, you can pretty much just attack. Depending on your team composition, you can just use attack to steamroll your way through, and the game remembers and allows you to recall the input for your 4 party members alongside the auto target system, which is now implemented into it. So you can set, your warriors to attack, your black mage to use their fire rod, your red mage to, attack, and your white mage to class protect. And then every round they'll just repeat that, right? However you want to set it. I found that to be really useful because there was entire sections of the game that with my particular team, I just set everyone to auto attack and just steamrolled through dungeons and stuff, right? Saving my spells and things for bosses and mini bosses and stuff like that. Which brings me to the dungeons in this game, right? The overworld exploration, it's very good. The cities are really cool. There's only maybe 10 or not even 10 of them, I think, fewer than 10 of them. But they're small, like one screen maps with a couple NPCs and a few shops, right? Which is fine. But
And
there's
some hidden
nothing super
shops that are
remarkable.
fun.
Yes, some hidden stuff that's pretty cool. I think it's really cool to find some of the um, more like ancient and advanced and hidden civilizations later on in the game as that comes up. You start to see the differences in these regions and how disconnected some of them actually are from each other, which I think is kind of cool. But then you get to the dungeons, right? Some of these dungeons go on forever. So the Marsh Cave, right? I just want to talk about this one in
God.
particular.
This is the worst offender of, like, when you think of bad dungeons, it's the Marsh Cave.
Yeah. So, what about the Marsh Cave that you recall is so frustrating? Can
It
you
was the
can you
Oh yeah.
explain?
Yeah. It was the poisoning. It was the status
Yeah.
effects. Um Thankfully this game has the quick save feature,
Yeah.
because I got way too deep in the Marsh Cave, realized that I wasn't ready to take it on, and then I couldn't get out.
Yes. Yeah.
And
It's
if
what,
I was
4 or
playing
5
on
floors, something like that.
something like that, and if I was on a cartridge, I would have been basically soft locked,
Yeah.
because my characters didn't have enough health to get through. I didn't have enough magic to ward off the enemies that were attacking me, and those are really strong enemies for that part of the
Yes.
game.
Yeah.
That difficulty spikes really high in the Marsh Cave. I
So
had
this is
to,
essentially your first major dungeon in the game, right? I mean, you do
yeah,
have you go to the Chaos Shrine early on, and it's a small little like 1 room, 2 room dungeon. There's a few smaller little fields and screens that you travel on, but this is like the first dungeon that you go into. So your party is low level. You have no money, so you probably don't have a whole lot in the way of items yet,
your magic's
unless
extremely limited.
you've what, maybe 4 spells in total for your casters at this point. That might be a little low, but so speaking of, so the spell system is clearly designed from the idea of tabletop role playing games, right? You have a certain number of spell slots per spell level. So your white mage might know how to cast up to third level white mage spells, but they might only be able to cast 5 first level spells, 2 third level spells, 1 fourth level spell, whatever it is. And once you've used those, unless you've got I don't remember, was there ethers in this game? I think there were, but they're
I think
super
so.
expensive, right? They're really expensive. So replenishing them is cost prohibitive, very difficult outside of resting at an inn. And if you're in a deep, long dungeon, you have to really conserve your spells. So items play a really important role. And the marsh cave, like you said, most of the enemies poison you. There are hundreds of random encounters because it's a very long, like a single screen of the marsh cave is like 3 or 4 times the size of most towns, right? And so you have to go through about 4 or 5 floors of this thing. And this is like every dungeon in the game, right? They're all these sprawling, multi-tiered, long dungeons that
Filled
have a
with dead
variety,
ends.
filled with dead ends, right? Trapped treasure chests that have really
Yep.
tough enemies in them, um, locked doors that you have to come back to later once you unlock magical keys and blah, blah, blah. Like so. This is what the game does: is you spend the bulk of your time in these dungeons with very limited resources. If you don't grind out money, you have very few items, and so you can get into situations without smart party composition, good preparation, and some effective saves where you are just kind of you're up a creek. And so I
I,
found this game to be um, really enjoyable, but the encounters they graded after a while.
Yeah. Well, the Marsh Cave specifically, the only way I got out of it was taking 2 steps, quick save. Taking 2 steps, quick save. That is the only way. And I had to actually look at a guide. I don't look at guides when I'm playing
Yeah,
these early games. I played through with a guide in the Marsh Cave, and it was still hard as hell.
yeah,
Like
it's hard.
unbelievable. That's the only dungeon that I remember like vividly from the game. Um, I
I
never
think
ever want to play it again.
Yeah, Mount Gulg is another one that really sticks out to me, and that's the fire volcano because most of the floor damages you with fire damage, and you're kind of forced to travel through all of it.
Yeah.
Which is pretty. Plus, there's a lot of like dead ends and traps and stuff in that one that really make it a tough little dungeon. But that is what I found really interesting is like the game does not pull punches for those early games. I mean, you do have to prepare. You need to have the top equipment. You need to make sure your party composition is effective, and you need to grind out money to buy enough items so that you can res characters, you can heal, you can cure status effects, because status effects play a big role in this in a way that in
Huge.
future Final Fantasies a lot of you can just ignore. Um, so that kind of brings us to gameplay, right? I mean, we're essentially there already. The dungeons can be real stressful. They're cool. I think that they're very diverse. There's a wide variety of them. I think especially in this game, I kind of like the fact that in the first Final Fantasy, the dungeons are not super linear. When you get to 3, they become really streamlined and linear and very brief. And I kind of like that they're a little longer in 1, right? That you kind of have to spend some time and go through some dead ends and really pay attention to where you're going. Though there is a map system in the Pixel remasters that takes away some of that difficulty, which again, those are features that were added. Imagine playing this game without the mini map. Couldn't
You're
do it.
calling like the Nintendo hotline.
Yeah. Um, and so that brings us to the gameplay, which is how do you succeed in these dungeons? And so my first question for this segment is, what was your party?
I had this feels like the most like mid party I could possibly have. I had my warrior or the fighter,
Hmm.
my white mage, black mage, red mage. In these games, I always
Yeah.
gravitate towards my mages,
Uh-huh.
and having the black and red and white mage made this a pretty easy game for me.
Yeah.
Let's also point out the black mage. One of the iconic Final Fantasy um, like emblems that went on to be part of like virtually every other mainline game up
Hmm.
until the 3D games.
Yeah.
Um, so that black mage pixel art is just so iconic and
Yeah.
had to have it on my team.
Yeah. The Black Mage, which then becomes the Black Wizard, which is the design inspiration for the Final Fantasy IX Black Mages, right? And Vivi in particular. All very cool. Interesting. So you went magic heavy for your team.
Always, yeah.
What's interesting here is that neither of us used a thief or a monk because I also built a magic team, but I did not have a black mage. I did 2 red mages for mine.
Well, that's
I did
versatile.
white mage, 2 red mage, warrior. That was my team. I figured, in these early games with magic being so limited, the red mage has the benefit of, being a pretty decent attacker with swords and whatnot. They can do pretty good damage, comparable to a warrior in some ways. And then the red wizard is just that iconic hat, that sweet red hat. I like the look of the red mage. So I had a couple of those guys in it, but 6 classes. That's it. With I guess 12 if you consider that they have upgrades, right?
That you
They
don't
have
have to do. I didn't realize that wasn't
yeah, the
mandatory.
advanced jobs. The advanced jobs are optional. You have to,
Yeah.
go to Bahamut and get some approval from him to do it. But if you do a little quest and you grab that, talk with him, you can unlock secondary quests, which really don't add much. They make them a
You,
little bit stronger in a few ways, and that's
you
about it.
look beefier though.
You look cool, and that is really, that's what we're here for. So yeah, we both went pretty magic heavy in a game that really kind of, again, I want to talk about this magic system, sort of punishes you for going the magic route. um,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
found
So
myself constantly strapped for spells.
no, I did too. And just to point out, this magic system in the PlayStation 1 version of this game and the Game Boy version of this game, they switched to an MP system.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, the Pixel Remaster is the first time we're getting back to that
Hmm.
traditional magic system that the first one had, because it's unintuitive and a little annoying.
Yeah.
You've got to make sure you're strapped with items if you're going to use magic at
Yeah.
all.
The third game also brings it back in the Pixel remasters, but it's expanded. You have more access to spells. But yeah, most of the games use an MP system where you can cast until you're out of MP, then you use Ether to restore MP. And what's nice about that is you're not limited to the set spells for each level. Because in this game, you get 3 spells for each level, and that's it. So you have to plan out your spells too, which is one of the reasons I brought 2 red mages. Is I figure I could have one of them focus being more of a backup white mage, the other one being more of a black mage, so that my white mage wasn't the only one with the ability to cure poison or cure stone or heal right when we're out of combat and stuff like that. And it
And
still ended up being,
the warrior can do some white magic, I think, late in the
once
game
they become a
too.
knight,
Yeah,
the
once they become
second
a knight.
class.
Yep. So I used mine as he moonlighted as a white mage in the second half of the game.
That all said, I would say that I spent roughly 80% of my gameplay and combat time in this game um, setting everyone to auto attack and putting it on auto battle. What about you?
No, I did it manually pretty much the entire time because I was new to this magic system.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that the magic system worked this way when I chose my magic first
Right.
party, because you pick before the game even gets started, right? You are shoved into this decision that's going to carry with you until the end of the game. There is no point where you can change classes
Yeah.
in Final Fantasy One as you can in some later games. And if I would have known that and known how the magic system went, I probably would have went more of a physical attacking party.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I had no idea.
It's interesting because in this game, we'll get to this when we talk about Final Fantasy 2 in a few, in a month or so. This game, you really can get by with just physical damage, right? Later games really punish you for not going magic,
Yeah.
at least to some extent. Though this game has quite a few boss fights that, if you have right the correct elements, if you have some casters with good spells, you can really steamroll some of the harder fights in this game. And that's really important because one thing I will say that this game has is difficulty spikes. And that's with the bosses in particular. I found that the dungeons, with the high combat encounter rate, with the length, right? It really becomes a war of attrition at the end of
Mhm.
these dungeons. You get to the last, screen or two, and you can be up against some really tough fights with not a lot of resources in your pocket if you
You're
haven't
barely
played
hanging
before.
on.
Yeah. There was so I'm going back to Mount Gulg again because this is like just to me the best designed and one of the more interesting dungeons outside of like, would you travel into the future and get to, fight robots and stuff like that up in the sky. But the the Mount Gulg boss is essentially a fire naga, right? Wielding a couple swords who is pretty resistant to most damage. She's hard to hit. She resists most things, but if you have a black mage or red mage with Blizzard or Blizzara or whatever you've got at that point in the game, you make quick work of that fight, right?
No
Whereas
problem.
if you're stuck with, a healer, who doesn't do a lot of damage, period, you're in trouble, right? You can use your ice staff and hope that you do enough damage that way. But, that's actually, I think that's two. I think you only have hammers in one.
Yep.
Um, you know, it can be real tricky sometimes. And I found that buffs and debuffs are actually very important in this first game. Like if you temper, which is basically like up the attack damage of your classes, they do a significant amount more damage and it makes the fights a whole lot easier. Did you use a lot of the stat buff or stat debuff
I
spells in the
don't
game?
I don't remember using them very much at all because early on in the game I was using them. I didn't know if they actually did anything because it was so slight at the beginning of the game. I was like, okay, is this one of those, early Nintendo games where you've got buffs and you've got debuffs, but they don't really make a big difference. So by the time I got to the end of the game, I had upgraded my spells. I had, my go-to spells that worked for me. I
Mhm.
didn't really worry about the buffs and debuffs all that much. I mean, haste. I think haste was in the first one, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It just
obviously
it,
using haste a lot.
what's interesting about haste is it just seems that it like unlike in later games where you get like two turns in on a boss, like with the ATB system, like with haste you get two. The only thing it really seems to do is make you go before the boss, right? Which is
Yeah,
sometimes all you need, right? To make sure that you get your heals in before the boss, whomps you a second time and knocks out your fighter. But it's really, yeah, I found that kind of interesting that like a lot of the buffs and stuff just help kind of build around battle flow, and encourage like organizing the fights in a way that make them more manageable in almost imperceptible ways sometimes. But I feel like pretty much every spell, despite the fact that a lot of them feel useless for large portions of the game, they all have like their moments where they shine, which I thought was really cool. Like certain dungeons lean really heavily in different status effects. So like you might never use the spell that removes blindness from your characters, but then you might get to a dungeon where every other fight you're getting hit with blindness and it's becoming a real issue when you're, leaning on a monk and a fighter to do most of your damage, right? And so
yeah,
I thought that was really cool that like even early on when this job system isn't deep, your fighter pretty much just uses attack the entire time, your black mage pretty much just uses cast spells the entire time. There's not a lot of depth or variety here, but it's enough that you can see why this game would be worth replaying with a different party composition, with different strategies in mind, by giving your characters different, spells for their different, levels and stuff like that, and creating a completely different gameplay experience. And yet, if you want to, you can, like I did, barrel your way through by just making sure you got the best equipment at the time and putting three guys with swords at the front of your party, and then it's game over, right? Just auto attack your way to the conclusion.
yeah. I
Um,
kind of want to see somebody do a 4 white mage run.
I think that would be next to impossible, but I
Do you
think
think it really would be impossible?
I don't know until late game when you get like holy. Um,
Yeah, they don't do much damage at
they
all.
don't they don't do a lot. It would be really hard. I think you could do it. It would just be really hard. I think you'd be leaning on items a lot, in a play like that. Whereas I think a three red mage party would just steamroll most of the game. Speaking of
That's what
which,
I'm
it's
doing next
interesting,
time.
right? Because the red mage, they can cast white and black magic, but they can't cast the highest level spells. So I never got to cast flare in the entire game because I didn't have a black mage, so I couldn't use the iconic spells from the game, which was kind of a bummer. But um, you know, all in all, I think that for a game of this era, for something so old and so, um, you know, hindered by its software and hardware at the time. It really does pull something interesting off, and it still feels fresh in a lot of ways. Again, I think the fatigue of modern game design has given me a little bit more respect for games that just kind of say go and let you kind of figure it out.